Well, hello again, everyone. So far, we've reflected on the scale and complexity of these enormous challenges facing us all as humanity as a whole, and then also taking time to reflect about how does it look in your context from your perspective. Overall, it's clear that we have a lot of urgent and radical work to do if we're going to get into that safe and just space for our societies. This feels enormously daunting, I know that. And yet, we have to be honest with ourselves that this is the task and the challenge facing today's generations in this time, especially if we want our children to have the opportunity to thrive all the way into their futures. So, let's get to work. In this session, we're going to explore what might help, what will it take, potentially, to create such change, what can enable such change, what's the role of innovation and challenge or mission-led innovation in creating such change, and what's the critical role for the public sector in helping to make such innovation and change happen. One thing that's clear is we need to move from incremental and ultimately still insufficient changes to making holistic and radical enough change to create thriving communities. Now, taking a mission-led approach to change is an important tool to help us make this shift. A mission-led approach forces us to really focus on doing what must be done in our communities to respond to the challenges that are facing us, rather than limiting to our presumptions about what we think can be done. And again, back to the donut tool, it helps us to frame the mission in terms of what we need to achieve in that holistic sense. The reframing to a mission-led approach is really essential to bridge this gap between the speed and scale of changes that are really needed and our current rate of progress. The American moon mission is a common reference example of a mission-led approach, as it was beautifully captured, as you can see here, by JFK. And he said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win." Now, what if we framed where we're trying to go in our communities in that kind of language, in that kind of sense? And this example captures how a mission should be sufficiently ambitious. It's fine and it's good if no one is quite sure how to achieve it. But people should still have a strong sense that it could be possible, tantalizingly close. And the way that mission is framed should ideally be co-created by citizens and stakeholders from a community and have a strong sense of, yes, that's where we're trying to go. It's also really important that the time frame for a mission is not too long, around a decade at the most, because if the goal is pushed too far into the future, we tend not to take it seriously, or seriously enough. Mariana Mazzucato from University College in London is a well-known advocate of such missions and the need for public sector innovation towards achieving them. She highlights how missions really help to provide directionality to innovation processes. And without this direction, innovation for what is really one of the problems. And in her work on the entrepreneurial state, she highlights how there has been a widespread tendency of the public sector in many places to retreat from playing such a strategic role in innovation and change. And that this has really undermined the capacity of the public sector to tackle these strategic grand challenges that are facing us. She argues that there's a really strong need for the public sector to take an active and entrepreneurial role, also in convening, not trying to solve everything, but convening collective community work on society's challenges, especially those that cannot be solved by individual actors on their own, doing their own thing. So this means that governments and the public sector need to relearn, rebuild capacity to work with ambition and creativity and entrepreneurship. This means the public sector needs to be able to experiment, to learn, and, dare we say it, fail in the process. She also really advocates that it's government who needs to be able to invest in mission-led change with courage and a long-term view, and also find ways to reap the rewards of such risk-taking, that an awful lot of the innovation and progress that we do see can be attributed to what the public sector has done to invest and make things possible, but we should get away from the idea of picking winners and being scared of failures. That's part of the complexity. But when public sector investment and change and innovation is successful, how are those benefits flowing back to communities? And she argues that this gets lost if the talk of public sector investment is mainly about de-risking for private capital to invest. So creativity, entrepreneurship, failing in pursuit of innovation, how do these suggestions compare to your current role and ways of working in the public sector? And largely taking up the challenge that Mariana Mazzucato has laid down, at the moment the European Union is more and more embracing this sort of mission-led approach, which is great. And this is largely, I think, a response to seeing that a lot of investment and a lot of support for still what has been quite incremental and sector-based research and innovation has indeed still failed to generate the outcomes and progress that Europe needs and wants and is striving for. So the overarching European Green Deal is a great high-level frame for mission-led change, with its headline commitments to create fair and prosperous societies that are decoupled from resource use and environmental harm. Within this, there's things like the Just Transition Mechanism. It's an initiative that really aims to ensure that the transition towards a climate-neutral economy happens in a fair way, and especially focused on the regions in Europe that at the moment will be most affected. They're the most dependent on high-carbon industries. So this is sort of basically becomes missions for very radical economic transition at a regional scale. So that's an interesting initiative. They've also created very explicitly five key missions for Europe that address climate neutrality, climate resilience, soil regeneration, ocean and water restoration, and cancer. And a great example of one of these missions is the one that aims to create 100 climate neutral and smart cities in Europe by 2030. That's climate neutral cities in 8 years from now. And excitingly, Greater Sarajevo was one of the few cities from the Western Balkans that recently applied to join the first group of cities pursuing this mission. So bravo, that's a very exciting step. Now the real work really begins, but great to see. So Europe is exploring this, how to create mission-led change. That's exciting. I don't think these initiatives have all of the answers yet by any means, but this commitment is admirable, and I think will also for sure open up opportunities also in Bosnia and Herzegovina to get support for mission-led public sector innovation. So something to make the most of. So I hope that this has given you some useful insights into the value of taking a mission-led approach to change and innovation. And now I would like to share with you some models that I find helpful for shaping and designing work to put these ideas into practice. Firstly, we'll use a tree as a metaphor and a model for thinking about how to design for mission-led change. So in this model, the missions and the community benefits that we're striving for are represented by the fruits on the tree. We could map these back to the donut. To achieve these outcomes, the whole tree needs to be strong and healthy. So the canopy of the tree then represents like a community's place, the world where we live, work, and play. So this could be a neighborhood, a city, a town, a region. And then you can imagine that the main branches in the canopy make up the key systems that we need to produce the fruits. And it's in these systems where we need to bring about changes that benefit everyone. And here we can think about things that probably spring first to mind. Things like housing, a good local economy, healthcare, education systems, energy supplies, public spaces, ecosystems. And as highlighted, we need to think about these in a systemic way, not too much by sectors. And I would imagine that these are the areas where you find most of your projects and work are focused. But so far we only have a half of a tree hanging in space. And so the tree rests upon, of course, its trunk. So what is the trunk of the tree in our model? Well, this is how we organize, how we hold together work in our community, the sort of structural part of how we govern processes of change. So obviously the public sector is key to this, but also not all of this. And then, as with any tree, we tend to pay less attention to what's below the ground. The roots and the soil system that actually really define whether a tree will flourish, whether it will be strong, and ultimately whether it will produce those healthy, nutritious fruit that we're aiming for. The conditions below the ground are also the hardest to change once a tree is planted, once the process is advancing. And properly preparing the ground requires upfront effort and investment. And so this is the area of what we call enablers of change, which I'll talk about a little bit more, as I think this can be a helpful frame for thinking about social innovation and the social innovation that the public sector can support to help change and action to flourish in the community towards those mission goals. This framework covers these 4 areas: collaborative communities, enabling economies, smarter systems, and municipal momentum. The first area is called collaborative communities because collaboration must be the foundation for agreeing on our community's goals and then finding the most effective ways of achieving them. How we work together and create collective value has to improve. So within this area, we focus on communication, co-creation processes, and collective management of community assets and processes. Next, we focus on enabling economies. Too often the economy is still considered an end in itself, rather than really a means to help us to collaborate, to prosper and live well. To turn the economy into a real enabler of change, justice and prosperity for everyone, we have to work on developing better business models, creating flows of transformative investment at the speed and at the scale really needed, and more innovative economic structures. Data and digital technology can help us to create a better future for sure, but let's also remember that being smart is an enabler rather than a goal in itself. Improvements in community systems can be achieved using a combination of data commons, interoperability, and that together these underpin smarter applications. And so this is what we cover under the area smarter systems. And then completing the circle, we come to the area of municipal momentum. Because we work mostly with communities and we focus on local government, but of course other layers of government are also having a critical role to play here. Government can use their tools like public procurement and policy to accelerate action, and also how well government is organised and ready to help to accelerate radical change is also a key enabler in any community. It links closely back, of course, to that trunk of the tree part of the tree frame. So in my and my colleagues' experience, these factors are critical to making change happen and also ensuring that maximum value is there for everyone in the community for the long term. As I said, this framework can be used as a tool to help with developing social innovations that support action and change towards a community's mission. And we're going to explore this tool a little bit more through the next exercise. One more real challenge for effective community change that I would like to highlight is a general crisis of collective imagination, and it's blocking many of us in many communities from even envisaging what we want for our future. And if you can't imagine the future you want, then you can't set a mission to achieve it. In this great book, Rob Hopkins from the Transition Movement pushes us to focus on what if, not what is. What if we had the cleanest air of any city in the world? What if everyone had plenty of healthy, locally produced food to eat? And so on. What pops to your mind in terms of what if questions? And he highlights how communities need to rebuild their capacity to imagine a better future and to ask what if, and then design for it together. And this does link closely to our area of collaborative communities, but perhaps collective imagination should really be seen as a precursor to all change and innovation work. Of course, in practice, this capacity for imagination actually needs to be iteratively rebuilt as part of the innovation and change process. So this means creating safe, playful spaces for citizens, organizations, and the community as a whole to come together, explore the assets they have, and how to use these and create new possibilities. This requires sustained effort, it's hard work, but some good examples include things like temporary street closures to create play spaces for children, imagination labs, co-creation and construction workshops, placemaking or tactical urbanism. So there's lots of good examples that you can use to sort of do this work in practice. But overall, the goal must be to involve citizens from all parts of the community and support them to feel like they can really contribute and be creative and trust each other in coming up with ideas for a possible future that everyone wants. And as highlighted by Mariana Mazzucato, as we talked about earlier, perhaps it is in the public sector where we have to do some of the most work in rebuilding our capacities for dreaming and imagination. Maybe at the risk of taking the tree metaphor too far, but we could consider that maybe collective imagination is like the wider ground in which a tree is planted. We can think a lot about the tree, but without the ground we can't even really have a tree. So in the coming days, I challenge you to reflect on this as well, and think about what are maybe some of the innovative approaches that you might use to help your colleagues and community to better dream and imagine the future that you're trying to create together, so that all the other elements of innovation and change and community building, community development can come together towards that mission. To wrap up, I have talked about how using missions can help us to set an ambitious direction for change and innovation in context of responding to those enormous challenges that are facing us, as we explored earlier. Missions need to be ambitious enough to push us to work on what must be done. This means getting out of silos and the incremental sector-based approaches that are still failing us. I've talked about how public sector innovation and entrepreneurialism is key to such mission-led change and maximising public value in the process. And I've noted how the EU is trying to move in this direction, which may help to open up some new support opportunities for you. I have used the metaphor of a tree to illustrate one way to think about how to organise and plan systemic change in pursuit of community missions, especially the importance of giving care and attention to enablers of change that are like the roots of the tree, less obvious but vital to the whole and thus achieving our goals. Finally, I highlighted how mission-led change depends on us having the collective capacity in our communities to imagine a better future and then to go for it together. Rebuilding this civic imagination capacity is an area ripe for publicly supported social innovation work. In the first session, we talked about the challenges facing humanity and the sense that we are at a final fork between better and worse futures. Ours is a critical moment in human history. Let us seize this moment and choose a beautiful path into the future like this one. We will never see around all of the corners ahead of us, but with the right intent, effort, and innovation, we can surely find a better way forward. We must.